ceremonies here for over 20 years on Veterans Day. And we're out here once again. Unlike a lot of Veterans Day, it's not snowing or raining. We actually have sunshine even though we're in the shade here. We're glad you all turned out. This is a signal of the commitment that we all feel to this ceremony and to the purpose that we gather on these ceremonies and at our meetings. Vietnam Veterans Against the War is one of those organizations that seems to be around forever. At least that's the way it is to us who have been in forever. A lot of people have asked me to, over the years, to have different religious people come up here and do a benediction or an invocation. Well, this year, people have asked me for an atheist prayer. I don't know one, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Neither raising our eyes to heaven in supplication, nor bowing our heads in submission, but looking straight at each other, we ask each other to be good to each other. And so our benediction is, be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes. Okay, a lot of things have been going on the past year that concerns veterans. Some of them have to do with international security and various warmongers around the world. A lot of it has to do with what goes on here in the States in helping ourselves, helping our fellow veterans. One of the things we're going to talk about today, a little later on, is post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of sexual trauma. But we want to start off with a general speech by Bill Davis, one of the national staff members at VVAW, a long-time member, and one of the people that we come to depend upon to keep up to date on things going on in the world and keep us briefed. Bill Davis. Good morning. One of the main themes that we're going to be speaking about, and some of the speakers are going to be speaking about today, is the plight of homeless veterans here in this city and around the country. Every day there's upwards of 15,000 homeless veterans looking for a place to sleep on the streets of Chicago. These veterans were not born to be homeless veterans. Homeless veterans were created just like all other veterans were created, but the homeless veterans, by and large, were people who went from the unemployment line into the military, out of the military, and back to the unemployment line, having very little to look forward to in this society. We were amazed a few years ago when we saw the number of homeless veterans who were Gulf War veterans. We understood the plights and the problems, the things that the Vietnam veterans have went up against in the large numbers. But for such a small fraction of veterans, it was amazing to discover the high percentage of these young people who had so quickly their lives had turned around. One day being giving a parade, the next day looking for a place to sleep on the streets of Chicago. The Clinton administration, like successive administrations before them, are looking to control the problem of Saddam Hussein, a problem that successive administrations created. They armed this man and gave him free license to do whatever he wanted in the Middle East because at the time he was one of their guys. Well, how quickly these things change. And when they change, suddenly he's one of the bad guys. There's no dispute that the man has, and the country and the problems that he's created over there. However, to continually bolster this guy up and pull this guy up as someone who has to be attacked. Today, the Clinton administration is saying they're looking at two strategies. One of a massive, incredibly massive, quick strike that is going to end the problem of Saddam Hussein. Or a long-term strategy and a long-term major military engagement to end the problem of Saddam Hussein. One of the major problems with that is they've already tried both of these things. Now, they talk all the time about it, the UN interceding and having the UN do the work, and UN is representing all the people, but by and large, these military excursions have been the part of the United States. And if the UN was to become involved, perhaps the money that the Clinton administration is talking about spending on this attack could be gone to paying off their debt to the United Nations, and that money could be channeled into some things like feeding the people of Iraq and taking care of the medical problems of the people of Iraq, and doing the sort of things that would undermine the control that this particular person has over his country. But no, instead the United States is looking at two very harsh military approaches that will do nothing more than exasperate the problem in the Middle East. It will not bring stability to the Middle East, and it will recreate thousands of more homeless veterans on the streets of this city and every major city in the United States. Thank you.
We realize it's dangerous out on the streets here in Chicago. There's fires everywhere. But it's also dangerous being anywhere in this world. There are weapons of mass destruction, so-called weapons of mass destruction, all over the world. But more importantly, there are crazy people all over the world. And every once in a while, they get together. So you got a crazy person and some weapons. It doesn't just happen in Iraq. It doesn't just happen in the Middle East. It happens all over. And our government is forced to deal with these international situations. We have a responsibility as citizens of this city, of this state, and of this country to voice our opinions about the correct way to deal with these international crises. Organizations have been around for a long time trying to help American citizens understand what's going on overseas and trying to help the people overseas deal with the problems. Much of these problems were created by American government action. One of the areas that we are most especially interested in is Latin America, Central America and South America. Places that, for a lot of us, are just around the corner, unlike the Middle East. A lot of things have been going on recently with the U.S. government getting involved in the war on drugs in Central and Latin America, and we just are very unfortunate in being misinformed by our media about a lot of the things going on. So we depend upon organizations of people who go down there and come back and tell us. And we're fortunate to have one of those people as a long member of our organization, Alen Romo from the Colombian Human Rights Organization, and many others.
Maybe it's globalization. Maybe it's a changing role of the governments of the world that explains the inconsistencies and incoherencies that we find in U.S. policy toward Colombia. Maybe that explains the fiasco that's called the war on drugs. In the last 7 years, U.S. policy has not resulted in a decline of the amount of cocaine coming into this country, despite that they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into counter-narcotics programs. The difference now is that maybe the cocaine's a little better. The difference now is that there's heroin coming in. 60% of the heroin comes from Colombia. The policy's probably ineffective because we're not really sending the money to fight the war on drugs as much as we are sending the money for a counterinsurgency program in Colombia, to the tune of $100 million a year sent to the Colombia security forces. Increasingly, now that's coming out in the open. And increasingly the U.S. media is issuing reports that maybe 40 to 50% of the national territory of Colombia is in the control of guerrillas. Yeah, the guerrillas are in those areas, control those areas, by no means. The Defense Intelligence reports that the guerrilla may have a victory in 5 years. But in fact, the paramilitary forces have dislodged the guerrillas from their traditional strongholds in Urabá, in the southern part of the country near Meta. And now they're slicing a line down the Magdalena Medio River, which goes down the central of the country. The paramilitaries are succeeding where the Colombian military has been failing. It is true that the guerrillas have finally gotten some connections with drugs. When the Sendero Luminoso forces were eliminated in Peru, a lot of the drug growing started moving across the border into Colombia. Colombian peasants started growing drugs in guerrilla territory, and that's the so-called narco-guerrilla connection. It's also true that the military of Colombia is connected with the drugs. and the paramilitaries work for the militaries and work for the drug traffickers. And this is not an assertion on my part. This is documented. This is documented by non-governmental organizations in the United States, and it's definitely documented in the media and non-governmental organizations in Colombia. So we find that we are backing, among all these forces, simply the forces of reaction. To what end? Over 100 paramilitary groups exist in Colombia, again documented. It's so developed that they're out in the open. They actually have national conferences. They actually call the media in for these conferences. They have pre-announced massacres now. They'll put it up in the village. There's going to be a massacre here. 2 months later, there's a massacre. It's a terror campaign. Last year, there were 185 politically motivated massacres in Colombia. Political killings are running at about 3,000 to 4,000 a year. Over 70% of these are attributed to paramilitary forces. Another 300 to 400 people are disappeared. The U.S. is not alone in backing these paramilitaries. Coca-Cola workers have found themselves the victims of union-busting efforts as a part of the management paramilitary collusion. Their union organizers are being assassinated by paramilitaries. Again, it's documented. Goodyear has found that one of the paramilitary units that is working, they have their own names, you know, death to the guerrillas, you know, death to communists, death to whoever they don't like. In this case, it's a paramilitary unit called Death to Trade Unionists that has taken on the trade unionists that are organizing for Goodyear. And British Petroleum has been caught giving money to state security forces, giving night vision goggles to some very suspicious characters. That's a story that's still evolving, as is the Amoco purchase of British Petroleum. So you know, International Human Rights Day, we're going to be over at the Amoco building, and please join us to take them on this question. About 300 trade unionists that are killed every year in the world because they're organizing for their rights, over half of those are from Colombia. Every year for 10 years, over half of those are from Colombia. 61 teachers last year were murdered in Colombia. 400 teachers have been murdered in Colombia in 5 years. CUT, which is the name of the largest labor confederation in Colombia, has seen 2,300 of its members murdered since it was formed in the mid-'80s. And many of you may have heard about the assassinations that went on in Barranca Bermeja of the Oil Workers Union, traditionally the strongest union in Colombia. And the oil refinery center of Barranca Bermeja was invaded by paramilitary units who kidnapped at least 25 members and put them on trial and assassinated them. It was a very, very deliberate, bloody effort on the paramilitary part to begin the incursion into the Barranca Bermeja stronghold. Chaos now reigns in Colombia. Over 1 million people have been displaced. 1 of every 40 Colombians is now an internally displaced person, either in a refugee camp, a squatter's village, or a barrio that is evolving from a squatter village into a barrio. Paramilitary control vast areas of Colombia. They vacated the entire area south of Panama. No longer has a population, a civilian population living there. The only population that lives there is paramilitaries and maybe some of their relatives. Drug traffickers own 40% of the arable land in Colombia. You have to ask, is U.S. policy accidentally inept or intentionally inept? We know it's racist. We definitely know it's brutal. And we definitely know that it's ineffective. It has destabilized communities in this country, and it's destabilized communities in Colombia. We have to ask what the U.S. interests in Colombia are. We know about the plans for the Pacific Coast. We know that they are losing the Panama Canal. We know a lot of countries in Latin America have been considered for alternative canals, and we know Colombia is at the top of the list right now. We know that they want to put either a dry or a wet canal through the Darien Gap. We know that they want to put railroads through there. We know that they want to connect the Pan American Highway way through there. We know that this is for the purpose of globalization, for the purpose of the transport of the goods between North and South America. And we know that it's a strategic interest to the U.S. military because of not only those efforts, but also because it has both coasts on the Pacific and the Caribbean, because the shipping lanes go past there, and because it provides internal access to the interior of South America. So the U.S. military is driving a lot of this policy. The head of the U.S. Southern Command, Colonel Wilhelm, says that the Colombia military is deficient. And among those deficiencies are an inability to do night operations, inability to do direct attack capabilities, some problems with communications and intelligence systems, and inability to operate on rivers and coasts, and an inability to sustain their forces once they have been committed. The U.S. in fact asserts that the Colombia, the guerrillas that are being fought have in fact are no longer motivated by Marxism, or this was asserted by General McCafferty. I don't think the other military forces necessarily agree with that. In fact, he says that the guerrillas are really only interested now in the drugs themselves. They're no longer politically committed to changing the country. And that would make us ask the question then, if the guerrillas are only using the money to fuel their war, then isn't it true that if we hadn't engaged in this policy in the first place, there would be no guerrillas? We would assert that the problem with the Colombian military is that it has over 100,000 graduates of the School of the Americas, and they're the worst ones. We would assert that the problem with the Colombian military is that it does not honor any international standards of human rights accords. In fact, Amnesty International documented in 1994 that 13 of the 14 Army battalions was engaged in human rights abuses. And when the U.S. military is so quick to label various forces in Colombia as being involved with drug trafficking and never going to look at the military or the paramilitary, so I don't know, did anybody see the news last night? Did anybody watch Spanish news? Wasn't there a Colombian, was he a general? Colombian military officer who flew a plane into Miami and it had, I believe, 1.44 kilos of cocaine on the Colombian Air Force plane. Why didn't you hear about that in the media? What does that say about where you're aiming your target? Well, it says you're aiming your target in the wrong place, and we've known that all along. So, I want you to know that the U.S. is increasing on the slippery slope to involvement in Colombia. I don't want to predict that it's going to get too heavy, but it's definitely headed in that direction. We know that on any given day, there's between 130 and 250 U.S. personnel in Colombia besides those that are permanently assigned. We know that there's 100 civilians that are employed by these corporations that are spraying aerial defoliants. And there's also been documentation recently about U.S. covert operations in Colombia that are going on. And I just want to read you just real quickly from an analysis on that. The Dallas Morning News reported that they're fighting by employing mercenaries, private contractors, and active-duty military personnel to support the armed forces in Colombia. The Morning News also reported that the Clinton administration has hired retired Green Berets, Gulf War veterans, and even a few figures that would be very familiar to you from the Central American covert operations that were backed by the CIA. Some say that the U.S. policy, some military advisors say off the record that the U.S. policy in Colombia is that of El Salvador, that they don't want there to be peace accords now because they want to strengthen the Colombian military so that it's strong enough to negotiate peace. This doesn't bode well for the current peace efforts that are going on in Colombia. I wanted to end my speech now by saying, in conclusion, but I guess I can't say there is a conclusion yet. What I do want to ask is that you get involved in helping us to bring this to the proper conclusion. Especially those of you who are in, I believe, the 5th Congressional District. The Soldier of Fortune magazine recently reported that Gilman's been recruiting some U.S. congressmen to go to Colombia and learn about the lovely military there. Please be aware your congressman is one of those people. Please work to make that congressman aware of the human rights violations that are going on there. And please get involved if you can. Thanks.
The things that are happening around the world and our reactions to them don't happen in a vacuum. One of the things is racism. Now, VVAW has been involved in the struggle against racism ever since its beginning. And that's one of the reasons why this government gets away with the foreign policies that it gets away with, because it realizes it can count on the racism of a lot of the citizens of this country. One of the ways that we have to deal with this racism is dealing with basically the symbols. You might have been reading in the newspapers over the past couple of years that there are a lot of people that are trying to make America aware of how racist the symbology is used in sports. Well, here in Illinois, we've got our own little controversy going on about that. And to let us know about, you've got to understand, VVAW has a lot of people in it who are not veterans. We welcome them with open arms, and they are very valuable members of this organization. One of them is Brooke Anderson from Champaign, Urbana, and she's going to let us in on what's going on down there. She's from the Anti-Racist Mascot Coalition. Is that the name of it? Clock is. Come on up here and let us in.
Good morning. My name is Brooke Anderson. I am a 19-year-old junior at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And born more than a decade after the start of VVAW, I'm a bit disadvantaged with respect to being able to speak about veterans issues. But what I do know is that my life and the lives of many of my fellow student activists have been profoundly and forever changed by the friendship and leadership of Vietnam veterans against the war. It is about this relationship between VVAW and student activism that I'm going to speak today. I was introduced to VVAW through my work with the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, PRC. It's a multi-issue, multi-tactical activist organization in Champaign-Urbana, working with Peace for Justice, and currently spearheading the movement to eliminate Chief Alinowick as the racist mascot and logo of the University of Illinois. Through working with the PRC, I became acquainted with several VVAW members that I now consider my dear friends, Joe, Jeff, Claudia, Lisa, and later Barry Romo and Bill Branson, who dedicated countless hours to training security volunteers for the numerous demonstrations and marches that we had last year, as well as for a national conference that we hosted in April. Anyways, since then, student activists have attended VVAW regional and national meetings, volunteered at the summer 1998 homeless stand down, camped out with the Vets and Friends this summer and fall, attended various VVAW parties, and contributed to VVAW's paper, The Veteran. And in all the time that we've spent together, storytelling has become an important activity. Listening to the stories of veterans and their allies, sometimes the pain is tangible, but the experience, you can't help experience it as one's own. But it can also be a healthy pain, like that of a hand or a foot to which blood is returning after having fallen asleep, a signal that something's wrong and that action is needed. But accompanying this pain is also some confusion, a disturbance of, a challenge to, the once coherent and comforting worldview, now seething with hypocrisy and contradiction, as we realize that the economic, social, and political systems that created the Vietnam War still exist today. The U.S. government continues to brutally crush liberation movements in other countries and within our own. It denies the right to self-determination. It supports dictatorial regimes and even provides arms, economic aid, and military training to such regimes. It destroys the environment, and with it the indigenous populations that depend on that land. And this same government, it creates and perpetuates an environment in which women are raped, in which people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and queer are beaten. And meanwhile, our leaders, our heroes, they waste away as political prisoners in maximum security prisons. Moreover, its veterans, the ones they sent off to fight their dirty wars for them. They let the vets starve and freeze on the streets, go without proper medical care, and fail to provide for their families. And at 19, I've still got a lot of growing up to do. But if I have anything to do with it, I'm not going to grow up in a world like this without trying to change the social, political, and economic institutions that perpetuate war and other atrocities. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Recognizing such interdependentness of oppressions, the student movement and the veterans movement have much to learn from each other and much to struggle for together. Over the past year, I've seen a kind of cross-pollination between students and veterans. VVAW members have provided leadership, friendship, historical perspective, advice, and inspiration to the next generation of student activists, and much of this over beer, no less. VVAW leaders have brought out the best in student activists by simply refusing to see anything but the best in us. As Nelson Mandela says, as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people the permission to do the same. And as we are liberated from our fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Students have contributed to the veterans movement contagious energy and vitality. Together, we have reaffirmed our commitment, our vision, and our sense of community within our respective movements. As students, we recognize that universities are not autonomous institutions, but rather serve the interests of a capitalist, racist, sexist, heterocentric military-industrial complex that we call the United States. Even worse, rationales for maintaining such an order are created within these universities, within our own political science, philosophy, and history classes. Therefore, if we are to effect change within the university system, we must engage in struggle to fundamentally alter the entire society. And to do this, we need to nurture a collective memory of resistance movements, their successes and their mistakes, and also the state's efforts to suppress these. The way in which the Vietnam War is remembered will in part determine the way in which my generation and generations to come will react to war and hopefully resist it with everything we've got. This is especially important because those institutions and those people responsible for war and injustice are trying to get us to forget something that if we remembered would get them in some serious trouble. Let me repeat that. Your government, our government, is trying to get us to forget something. The real history and lesson of the Vietnam War and the lies they told about it. They're trying to get us to forget the lessons of the anti-war movement, the history of resistance within the United States and the world over, of people struggling to be free. We're supposed to forget this rich history of resistance because they know if we remember, then there will never be another Vietnam War. There will never be another Wounded Knee. There will never be another Gulf War, another counterintelligence program. There will never be more war, not if we can help it. We've got a right to be free, to be educated, to do meaningful work, to have decent child care and health care. We've got a right to sexual equality, to love whomever and however we choose, to leave a healthy planet for our children. We have a right to demand justice, to demand that our histories not be rewritten by those who murdered for profit. In the age of globalization, it's easy to feel powerless, and that's no mistake. The system is set up to disempower, to create the illusion that change is hopeless, that with their media, with their power, their legal system, that we're stuck with the system we've got. But that's not power. Power is about people being able to translate a perception of social injustice, that sickening feeling watching the evening news, that anger at being witness to such brutality, translating all that into a program of action. It's about compassionate searching minds. It's about people acting in solidarity to promote justice. And it cannot fail because you cannot arrest, imprison, or kill an instinct for justice. And this is what has been nurtured by the symbiotic relationship between VVAW and the next generation of student activists. And so the best way to honor our sisters and brothers that we've lost in struggle is to continue to work for justice. I think it goes something like, remember the dead and fight like hell for the living. And as students get involved in VVAW, we're here to bear witness, to become part of what we have learned, and to speak to power those truths which have been imparted to us, and we will continue to do so long after we're all gone.
one of the reasons I come here. Many of you know that I do veterans counseling. I've done that all my life. And one of the problems is I hear so many horror stories that I get depressed. So when a young person comes in and starts talking like this, I got the energy to go on until next Veterans Day. And that's what it is, year to year. I've heard a lot of stories in my time, and as you might expect, there are very few who have heard more. Those would be people who do it on a full-time basis. People who work in the vet centers all across the country spend their lives trying to help us deal with what we've gone through and what we're going through today. One of those people is here with us today. Her name's Jeannie Douglas. I want you to get a round of applause for one of the people we depend on.
Each year that I come down here, you have a little bit bigger crowd. That must mean you're doing your job. I wanted to tell you about an experience I had a few months ago. I was taking my daughter, who's 14, with some of her friends to a destination that was about an hour away. So there was time for all of them to sit in the back seat and chatter. And we had the gift of time for them to think about many issues. They began to talk about school and teachers and, of course, inevitably boys. But then they moved on to a more serious topics. They talked a long time about Clinton and what his behavior meant. They talked about gay rights. And then they began to talk, and this was to my surprise, they began to talk about women in the military. They were in agreement that women should be allowed to join the military, but they were in disagreement about whether or not women should be allowed to fight in combat. There was a great debate, which I was abstaining from, when my daughter decided to bring me into the conversation to bolster her position. She wanted me to agree that women should not be in combat. Well, anybody who's raised a teenager knows about that sinking feeling when you are asked to give a black and white answer to a complex question, a question that's decidedly gray. So I stuttered a bit before I answered. And then I felt the feminist part of me had to speak first, and I said that if women expected equal rights, then of course they had to serve in the military, and they had to do the ugly jobs as well as the good jobs, and that if there was a war situation, that women should carry their weight. But then the pacifist side of me felt like it had to speak, so I said, I wondered if the better question, if the more important question, was whether or not anyone should serve in combat. Well, I thought I'd said something fairly profound, and there was a moment of silence in the back seat. And then they began to talk about whether girls should have to take swimming in high school. I had a lot more wise things to say. I wanted to talk to them about tremendous scarring, both physical and psychological, that occurs when people are forced to endure combat. I had a lot to say about that. I wanted to talk about the political forces that lead us to believe that war or combat of any kind is a viable solution to a problem. I wanted to talk about racism and classism that informs the way that we choose the people that fight the wars that are fought today. I wanted to talk about individual responsibility to fight for peace and justice. I had many important things to discuss, but the moment had passed, and my opinion was sought on how early, at what age, a girl should have her navel pierced. So I drove on, and I mused about that conversation in my head while they went on to talk of many other things. These were young girls who were innocent, who were smart, who were impressionable, who were funny, who trusted the world to provide a safe place for them. They were perfect, in my opinion, humble though it was. But listening to their chatter made me think that this generation of young people, that every generation of young people should be spared the enormous suffering that is inevitable if we go to war or any kind of armed conflict. I know that this is not the original thought. I know that I'm not the first mother to love her child and want to spare them. But it seems to me that if we focus on the children of our world today, that we can remind ourselves again and again that working for peace is the most valuable work that we can do. We must honor the fallen soldier. We must respect and care for the veteran. But our greatest challenge is to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I appreciate this moment for us to reflect on what veterans have done for our country and how we can best provide a safer world for the next generation. Thank you.
You can see why we depend on Jeannie so much. One of the things that she didn't mention is Friday the 13th is coming up in a couple of days, and lucky for us, that's when we're doing a stand down for homeless veterans in Chicago. It's going to be a one-day stand down. We'll be handing out winter clothing and giving them a hot meal. Jeannie was the last speaker that we're going to have today. As you see, there's flowers out there. I wanted to make myself available for any counseling afterwards, but I also brought with me excerpts from the Veterans Administration Manual on PTSD for sexual trauma. Jeannie has those, and she can hand them out. Part of the reason is doing disability claims with the Veterans Administration is a very complex task. It's made even more complex by the rules that they have to deal with, that is the Veterans Administration. Part of these rules has to do with, unfortunately, PTSD due to sexual trauma. And basically, you need to know the rules if you're going to try to get in and put in a claim. Most women who have endured this kind of abuse in the military have not complained about it. My mother grew up in the military, and she has stories to tell, but one of the things is the women who have to endure this in the military deserve compensation for what was done to them. There should be no argument about this. Unfortunately, because of the rules in the Veterans Administration, it's almost impossible to win these kind of claims. And even if you win it, there's a lot of misunderstanding about how bad off things are. What I'm talking about is post-traumatic stress disorder has severe psychological trauma, and it can be totally debilitating. It can put you out of action completely. The recovery from this is long and hard, and you need a lot of support to make it through it. So I want everybody to know that there are rules out there for the VA that they have to obey, and my job is to force them to do that. As soon as they get passed, we're going to meander on over to the reflection pool that is closed up because it would be iced over if it weren't. And we can lay our flowers there. You can take them home with you in a remembrance. We have plenty today for you to take home. I want to thank you all for showing up here. This has been, for me, the reason I come out here. And Barry wants to say something. Oh, Barry? Oh, we're going to Barry's afterwards. Okay, so if you want to warm up, talk to Barry. He'll give you directions over there. Thank you all for showing up here, and we'll be back here.